Now, another nice thing about the ASA device is if you do a conf-t, you get to global config mode, and you could do a configure, and then I'm going to type FA and hit tab, and there is a command called configure factory-default. So in step 4 in this lab, they talk about the settings that are the factory default settings. So if I was to put this command in here, it would automatically configure the ASA device with the factory default settings. Well, what are the factory default settings? Factory default settings will basically set these items up for you automatically, and they're pretty useful. And you can see we've got them listed here, and this comes right from the lab in part 4. Inside VLAN 1 interface on Ethernet 01 through 07, those switch ports will all belong to VLAN 1, and the IP address for the VLAN would be 192.168.1.1, and the subnet mask 24/24 subnet mask. The outside VLAN 2 interface is configured by default on Ethernet 00 switch port, and it's going to, by default, if you use the factory default settings, this outside interface, this VLAN 2 interface, will pick up its IP address automatically using DHCP. So it'll try to pick up an IP address from your ISP by default. The default route for the ASA device will also be coming from that ISP when it picks up that information. And also, by default, factory defaults will set up NAT so that all IP addresses are translated from the private 192.168.1 network to the outside interface with a port address translation. There is, by default, an access list set up so that users from inside the network, on the private side of the network, are allowed access to the outside, but the outside users or people contacting the ASA device directly from the outside are blocked by default. The DHCP server is enabled by default, so all you have to do is hook up your PC or your laptop to either ports 1 through 7, and you will pick up an IP address on the one network. And the HTTP server on the ASA device is enabled by default, and you'll be able to basically open up a web browser and get right to the ASA device and manage it through a web browser graphically because the HTTP server is on. And by default, and this is an important part of the factory default settings, there are no console or enable passwords that are set up by default when you use the factory default settings. So once again, that would happen if I put in this command right here. But in the lab, we're not going to do that. What we're going to do is we're going to erase our configuration, and we're going to start from scratch. Okay, so let's do that. So what we're going to do is I'll just back out of this. I'll hit Q on the keyboard and hit Enter to get back to privileged user mode. And we're going to do a write erase. And that's going to, if I hit Enter, confirm and erase the configuration, the startup configuration in flash memory. So if I do a show start right now, you'll see that there's no configuration in flash memory. So basically, we've wiped our startup configuration. So what we want to do now is reload. So we'll reload. I'll hit reload and save. No, we're not going to save. And proceed with the reload. Let's see here, that didn't take. So what I'm going to do is need to do that again. Reload, and I'll hit no, and proceed with reload, and hit enter, and you should see the shutdown message when it's actually reloading. All right. Now, you'll notice right here, if you use the break or escape key, you could end up in ROM monitor mode, or ROM-on, and that would help you to do password recovery if you were in trouble and needed to recover a password on the ASA device. The ASA device is still reloading, and what I'd like to let you know about here at this point is try to refrain from hitting the enter key or tapping the keys on your keyboard when the device is reloading, because there is a pre-configuration wizard when you've erased the startup config and you reload, and it will take those as entries in the pre-configuration wizard if you start hitting the enter key. So I'm going to not hit any keys on the keyboard and just wait for the device to restart. Okay, as you can see, we've finished reloading the ASA device, and this is the pre-configure dialog that says, hey, do you want to do a pre-configure firewall interactive prompts? This time we're going to hit no, so we'll type in no and hit enter, and we're just going to go directly to the command line. So now you can see it says the default prompt, which is Cisco ASA, and we're just going to hit enable and hit enter, and if you hit enter again, we're in privileged user mode. So notice we wiped out the startup configuration, and there's no password now to get to privileged user mode. So now we're going to configure the ASA device just enough so that we can get our ASDM, our graphical user tool, going, and then we can try to do the rest from the web browser. So to do this, what we're going to do is we'll start off with global config mode, and we're going to type in no for sending anonymous reporting or enabling anonymous reporting. All right, so now we're in global config mode. We're going to do an interface VLAN 1 and set up VLAN 1 first. We're going to give it a name interface inside, which is the proper name for the inside VLAN. All right, and security level for the inside, it recognizes the inside as the interface name, and it sets the inside security level to 100 by default, which is a trusted security level. So let's set up the IP address and exit. So now interface VLAN 1 is set up. Now if we do a show interface IP brief, you'll see that the interface is in fact down. So all of these switch ports are administratively down by default since we bypassed the pre-configuration wizard. So we're going to need to bring up any switch ports that we want to use. So we'll do an interface E0/1, and that'll take us into interface configuration mode, and we're going to do a no shut. Now, why didn't I do a switch port access VLAN 1? Because all of these switch ports are by default part of VLAN 1. So that's all we need to do is just do a no shut command and activate it, and it's automatically going to be part of VLAN 1. Now if we do a show interface IP brief, you can see that switch port Ethernet 01 is up and up. So it's physically up and the protocol is up. Okay. So now let's set up interface VLAN 2. So we'll do interface, or just INT, VLAN 2, and we'll do the name IF, or name interface, outside. You can see that the security level is set to 0 by default, and we'll set up the IP address for interface VLAN 2. We'll do that through the ASDM, through the Security Device Manager, through the web browser. So all we need to do now is say interface Ethernet 0/0 and set the switch port access to VLAN 2. All right, that looks good. No shut. And both interfaces should be up. So now, in step 7, what we need to do, if we're going to connect to the ASA device, the 5505, through the web browser, we're also going to need to turn on the web server. So I'll do a conf t to go directly to global config mode, HTTP server enable, and then we'll set which IP addresses are able to contact the ASA device through the web browser. So we'll say 192.168.1.0 and the subnet mask. And from the inside interface, so anybody on the one network will be able to reach the ASA device through the graphical user web tool. All right, so that looks pretty good. Let's test our connections. So what we'll do is we'll open up a command prompt and we'll see if we can ping the ASA device from our laptop. Remember that I am right now PCB at 1.3, so I should now be able to ping the ASA device at 192.168.1.1. So that's what I'm going to try to do. And you can see I can ping the device, so that's pretty good. And so now what we want to do is we want to see if we can contact the ASA device through a web browser. So what we'll do is we'll open up, I've got a web browser right here, and you're going to need to contact it through https:// and then put in the IP address of the ASA device. And when we do that, you're going to need to accept the connection. So I understand the risks. I'm going to add an exception, and I'm going to confirm the exception. And there's the ASA device, the ASDM, Adaptive Security Device Manager. And what we can do is we have a choice here of what we want to do. We can install the ASDM launcher on our local computer. We can run the startup wizard, or we can just run ASDM, and that's what we're going to do. So we'll just hit run ASDM, and we'll click OK. And it's going to open up. I'm going to accept the security certificate and always trust it. Okay. Username, password. I don't believe we set a username yet, and I don't believe we set a password yet. So I'm just going to click OK, and you can see no username, no password, and the ASDM launcher is working, and it should start up in a second. Okay. All right. We've got ASDM working in a web browser, and from here, what we can do is, through the web browser, we've contacted the ASA 5505 using the ASDM through a Java applet in our web browser, and now we can configure the device. Notice on the dashboard, we can see the interface statuses. You can see there's our inside interface with our IP address that we set up on the command line. You can see that it's up and up. There's our outside interface, and remember, we did not set up an IP address, so we need to do that. And we're going to do that in the next part. You can see traffic, all kinds of things.